This is a video tutorial on how to create diagrams using Rhino and Adobe Illustrator. You can use any version of Rhino and Adobe Illustrator to create these kinds of diagrams, whether it's a massing or programmatic or any kind of three-dimensional diagram. You can use these two programs in conjunction or individually. I go through a very thorough step-by-step process on how to create these diagrams because this video is intended for people who are comfortable with Rhino and Illustrator, but are still learning some new commands and some new options. The steps might seem a little redundant for some, but that's just to reinforce the learning process. The first step we're going to do is modify the display mode in Rhino. And to do that, you're going to type in Options and then go down to View, Display Modes, and click on Rendered. And so we're going to modify the rendered view. The first thing that we're going to modify is the background color under the viewport settings. We're going to make it a solid color, white, so that looks like it's kind of floating in space. And then we're going to modify the ground plane settings. We're going to make it custom, and we're going to make sure that on is not checked and that shadow only is checked with the other default settings. This is so that the model will look like it's floating in space. For shade settings, you can just go ahead and copy what you see on the video. And as a reminder, you can always pause this video and copy what you see. But it's really important that we have the back face settings also as rendered material, because when we apply the colors to the model, we're going to be using a rendered material. And so we want the back face, not just the front, but also the back to have the same rendered material. For visibility, you can go ahead and copy the settings that you see there. And then down to the lighting scene, we want to select scene lighting. And as a reminder, you can always pause the video and just copy the settings. What's really important to understand is that in this display mode, you can modify any object. So in Rhino, Rhino is composed of points, lines, or they call it curves, planes, surfaces, polysurfaces, meshes, sub-Ds. And so you can modify how all of these geometries are displayed in Rhino, which is very helpful from a graphic output, not just in Rhino itself, but from like a presentation standpoint. And so we're going to go ahead and modify how curves and surfaces and shadows appear in the rendered view. Click on Rendered under Display Modes and go down to Objects. This is where we're going to go ahead and modify all of the elements, like curves. We want to make that gray with a pixel width of 1. And then you can pick any gray tone that you like. It doesn't have to be the one that I'm showing on here. Surfaces, same thing. We want to give it an edge of 1, and we want to make sure that it has a gray tone. Again, just go ahead and copy the settings. I wouldn't worry about clipping planes, even though I have it selected. I wouldn't worry about that. That's for another video. Now in shadows, we want to make sure that the transparent objects are always cast shadows, and the video memory usage and the skylight quality and soft edge quality, they're all on the maximum values. So if you go and switch the view now to rendered view, you're going to see how the object looks like it's just floating there. And if you notice all of the edges, they're gray, they're not black. We want to keep it light. So now the next step is we're going to create layers. And we're going to assign layers to the program and give it a material. It's important that you're organized with this. So as an example, we're going to create a layer that's based off a color. I already had layers made, so I have to rename some of the materials. You can go ahead and pick any color that you like. I typically like lighter tones in my renderings, so you can always go back and modify the colors if you don't like them. And I want to give it actually a slight transparency of around 20 to 25%. And this will give it a little bit of depth to your model. And you can just go ahead and create a new layer or duplicate the layer, and you can also duplicate the material. And this is a little redundant, but I just want you to understand how to do the process. So I can go and duplicate this material right here and rename it, and then change the color. And that's all you have to do. And it's just a repetitive process. It's important to note that you want to be organized when you create these type of program diagrams. In any 3D model, you want to be quite organized with your layer protocol. But in general, when it comes to program, architecturally speaking, you're going to have so many program pieces, or maybe not that many, but in general, you're going to have different program pieces, whether it's an academic program or a business program or a recreation program. You might have things that are classrooms, offices, gathering spaces, circulation, support spaces. And so when you make these program diagrams, you want to make sure that you're either organizing your layer by the program or by the color associated to the program so that it's very easy to work with when you move to Adobe Illustrator. And it's just really good practice in general, both professionally and academically, to just have very clean layering protocol. So now the next thing we're going to do is just assign these layers to each of the geometries in Rhino. And there's a lot of ways of doing this. One way is clicking on the geometry and then just going down on the bottom and clicking on the layer, and it'll automatically assign that object to that layer. There's like 3 or 4 or even 5 different ways of doing this, but for me, this is the quickest way. And I just want you to pay attention again to the coloring. If you notice, the actual edge color is all gray. It's not black. Again, you see, if we used a black edge color and curve color, it would have started to compete with the actual program block color. We don't want that. We don't want any competition to happen between what we're representing in our graphic, whether it's a diagram or a rendering or anything like that. And so now we're gonna just save a view. You know, there's a difference between perspective view and parallel view, typically isometric versus perspective. We're gonna stick to parallel view, and we're gonna name the view. I typically like to name my views really short letters like V1, V2, so I can always type the name of my view. So if you go to named view, you'll save your view, give it a name. Again, I like to keep it short because I can always type the name of my view. This is an exploded version of the diagram, and I'm just matching properties to get the same rendering materials on the programmatic objects. The next step is make 2D. We want to go ahead and type in the make 2D command and copy these settings again. Make sure that your projection is on the current view and that your object properties has maintained source layers, which is very important when we take it to Adobe Illustrator. We want to keep our layers. Have the items checked as you see, except scene silhouette and register with previous. What's very important is that you make sure that you have your viewport rectangle selected. That's going to come handy when we proportion and size the make 2D and the overlay with the rendering. And you'll see what I mean in the next couple of steps. I typically like to group my make 2D immediately after it makes 2D, just because it's easier to select. And then I'll go to top view, and please excuse the black background. I just like to have a black background in my non-rendered view. But on the top view, I just type in ZS, zoom selected, ZS, and that will automatically take me to my make 2D. And then I just type of rearrange it on the I guess the top. And this is another diagram, a blown up axon diagram that we're also going to do in conjunction with the, I guess, collapsed program diagram, just to see the different options that we have. And again, we're just going to go ahead and set up the view, set up the angle that we like, type in named view, give it a name. So this one, I'm going to call it V2. So we're going to go ahead and do the exact same settings. We're going to make 2D the V2, the blown up axon, the exact same settings, and then just rearrange it on the top space. This SEP is optional. You don't have to do it. As long as you have it grouped and separate, you can keep it wherever you like. There are instances where you want to keep it as close to the origin point as possible when you export things as Make 2D, but that's for a completely different tutorial. And then, as you can tell, because I gave it such short names, I can toggle back and forth quite easily between the views. So if I type in V2 versus V1, I can go back and forth quite quickly, and you don't have to always go and click on the named view to access your view. So now the next step that we're going to do is do the view capture to file. And the view capture to file is going to basically take a screenshot. And we want to have a transparent background. That's very important. We have a transparent background. And again, now you're starting to understand why the visual settings are really important that we first did in our first step, because we want to have no ground plane. So that will allow you to have a true transparent background. So we'll have no ground plane with a transparent background. The resolution, we're first going to click on viewport again to match the viewport boundary of the Make 2D. And then we're going to click on custom because the custom will use your last used settings. So we'll do viewport, and then you can make sure that you have your viewport aspect locked, and then you will upscale your viewport aspect or the window. Like I typically double it or triple it, doesn't matter, but I like to upscale. So when I downscale, I'm okay if I have to downscale. And we always want to save any transparent background object as a PNG or as a TIFF. You don't want to save it as a JPEG because it'll be a solid white background. And then you'll do the exact same thing to V2. Again, this stuff is repetitive, so you're going to see it again if you miss it. And you can always pause the video if you want to see the actual settings. So that's why I kind of repeat the steps again. And now the next thing you're going to do is just export your Make 2Ds. You can export them together. I exported them individually just for redundancy. You can keep the settings here. I typically like to keep CMYK if you know you're going to print this. If you're going to keep it in digital space and only show on a computer, you can do RGB. We can talk about scales on a different tutorial video. I just want to keep this general for now. And you're basically done. That's it. So the Rhino portion is done. The prep for Rhino is done. And now it's just all pure Illustrator work. So the artboard that I'm using for Adobe Illustrator, I'm doing an 11 by 17. You can do whatever size you like, but just make sure that you have your proportions linked in the transform tab, and that when you scale your artwork, scale it to the size of the artboard. So that's going to keep your proportions locked. So I scaled this to a total width of 17. And if you drag the top left corner of your ruler in Adobe Illustrator to the top left corner of your artboard, it'll make sure that the zero, like the increment 0 of your measuring, is always going to start at that top left corner. And I'm just toggling Control Y. If you do Control Y, that gives you outline view, which is easier to see things. So the first thing I always do in Adobe Illustrator is I just make all of the line weights the same and like very skinny, like a 0.1 or 0.15. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new artboard. And I'm going to copy and paste the other file into this file. I should have just made 2D at the same time instead of made 2D individually. So if you go down in your layer settings, you can do paste remembers layers, and that will bring all of the layers from one Illustrator file to the next when you copy and paste. So I'll just go ahead and paste it in there, and it will bring all of the layers in. So it'll maintain the layers. And again, you see I just want to increase it by a 17-inch width proportionally and make all the line widths very thin. And now we're just going to go ahead and modify all the dashed lines. So if I hold Control and select the circle on the far right of the hidden curves layers. Again, this is why maintain source layers is important when you make 2D, because it'll bring all of these layers with you. I'll probably change the dashed width. This is the default Rhino stuff. I'll get rid of the gap and keep it default as blank, and then you can modify the dash to what you think is aesthetically pleasing. Again, I want to make all of the line colors on here except the emphatic lines, like the outlines, as a gray. So again, all of these colors on here, all of the lines and even the annotations that you're going to see later on are going to be like an 80% K value, except for like the thick outline that we're going to give. This is the dashed line of the exploded elements. It's more so just used as an alignment tool, and you don't want to have the same kind of dashed line that you're using for your hidden lines. And so you want to have a differentiation between the alignment line and your hidden line. So now we're going to create a thick outline. So we're going to go ahead and select the two artboards with everything inside of them, duplicate them upwards, and you're going to select again the entire boundary of all of the curves, and then you're going to do a shape builder. And you just click inside of that region, it'll create an outline automatically. And so this outline is what we're going to use as that thick black outline, and that's going to be the only element that's black in this diagram. Everything else is going to be either that 80% gray, or the 80%, yeah, the 80% gray, or it's going to be the color. Then this outline is going to be a thick black tone, which gives emphasis and which helps emphasize either the programmatic blocks or like your masking blocks or any element that you want to emphasize. But in general, from an aesthetic standpoint, you don't want to have too many competing elements. And so you want to emphasize very specific things, and everything else should be secondary or tertiary at best. I am going to create a couple layers. One layer is going to be the outline layer. That's going to go in the very top. And then another layer is going to be the rendering layer. That's going to go in the very bottom. And then we're going to create additional layers later on. And so one thing that I want to emphasize, I'll probably emphasize it a couple times, is that the way that you see it now in Illustrator is, I would say, okay. When we export this as a high quality JPEG or PNG or whatever file that you want, it's gonna look fantastic. Right now it looks a little muddy, it looks a little rough, but when you actually export it to the file that you want, it's gonna look very sharp, very clean. The transparencies are gonna look like glass or like resin. It's gonna look fantastic. And since we have this at the same viewport boundary proportion as our Make 2D, we can just simply scale down the view capture or rendering to 17-inch width as well, and it'll line up perfectly. And you can just line it up by eye, to be honest. You can just zoom in, 2400% and just line it up by eye. No one's ever going to notice it unless you bring in a magnifying glass and put your face right up close to the screen or on a or like on a print. So you can just do this by eye. I wouldn't worry about it. I think like we're zoomed in 2400%, 600%, so it's no big deal at all. And again, what you see is just like a preview mode of the actual diagram. When you see it exported, it's going to look fantastic. And when it comes to colors, you can even in Illustrator change the color mode between CMYK and RGB, but that's really up to you depending on what medium you're presenting this in, if it's digital or print. So the next item we're going to work on are annotations, like our texts and our labels. And annotations are so important when it comes to graphic representation in any design, in architecture, in portfolio and layouts, and anything that you're presenting design work. Annotations is so crucial to balancing a page, to balancing a graphic element. And it can make a serious drawing look silly, and it can make a silly drawing look serious, depending how you use your annotations. And so we're just going to go ahead and center our artwork on the artboard. And when I say artwork, I mean like diagrams or whatever graphic element that you have. We want to make sure it's just visually centered, not like exactly centered, because when you put your labels on there, it's going to have, you know, a centering within itself. I'm just going to use basic Arial. It's very safe. You can use whatever font you like, but again, your fonts are a statement. We're going to make sure that the tracking is quite wide, actually, like a 300-point tracking on a black, not the color black, but the thickness black, Arial black, all caps. And again, we're going to change the color of this to, I think, like 80%. But we want to add a lot of tracking onto this because it just gives relief to the text and it gives a certain proportion to the text. Then we're going to add a subtitle, which is going to be regular. Again, same size of text, just different casing. It's going to be just regular or different style. It's just going to be a regular. So you have like thick black main title, and then you're going to have a subtitle. And you can, if you don't like that, you don't have to do that. You can just do like a really thin, spaced out regular title if you wanted to. It's based on your aesthetic preferences. But we're going to make sure that the tracking is proportional to the subtitle as well. So, you have to play around with it. Maybe 200, maybe 150. Again, depends on your sheet size, your font size. And again, we're going to go ahead and make the color here 80%. 80% K. And then we'll go ahead and use the align, and we'll just align them to the selection, align them along centers, which is very important. And to be honest, you can do the annotation portion of this in InDesign if you want to do. Like, I highly recommend doing any layouts in InDesign. I would never do it in Illustrator, but it's the same method or the same principles in InDesign. And so now the next thing that we're going to do is the labels. One thing that I should have done is I should have changed the text size of the labels. I would have made them 2 points smaller. Like I would have made them 10 point on here. So like in general, you want to make it like around, I don't know, like 5% smaller than the main title, because you just don't want things to compete. You want the title to be the title with its own size, and you want the labels to be the labels with its own size, and you just keep that consistent throughout your representation. But yeah, we're just going to go ahead and just do our labels. Again, even the way you lay out your labels, like you don't want your labels too close, you don't want your labels too far, but you want your labels to fill the space. And, whether the design crit or whoever's viewing your project is going to read the labels or not, or read your annotations, that doesn't really matter per se. What matters is that it's visually appealing when you look at your labels on a sheet. You don't want it to be distracting. You just want it to be a supportive element. And it gives your diagram a very specific look, and it gives it an emphasis. You clearly don't want to write anything on there. You want to write meaningful things on your labels and on your annotations. But from a graphic standpoint, they are filling space. And so you want to make sure it fills space wisely. I'm using a solid dot arrowhead on here. And I'm playing around with the scale of the arrowhead. And again, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that they're aligned, on the center by using the alignment feature on here. I like to align by centers. But, this is just like a very tedious aspect of it. It's pretty self-explanatory when you watch the video. And just as you can tell, like when you have your labels on here, it already starts to change the look of the diagram. It's like, I guess, like the finishing touch of any graphic element, whether it's floor plans or sections or axons and diagrams. Labels and annotations are so key to just giving it a certain look on a page. This is strictly speaking from a layout standpoint and a presentation standpoint. So finally, we're going to go ahead and we're going to export these files. I select artboard, and you can do JPEG or PNG or TIFF. It doesn't matter. And I guess the color space and the PPI, DPI depends if you're doing this digital or if you're doing this print, but I always keep it high quality. If it's print, nothing less than 300, typically go even 500 sometimes, depending on where I'm printing this. And as you can tell, once you see this on the actual export, even if you did this on Illustrator and you exported it, make sure you export like, press quality or very high quality. But if you can tell there's a huge difference when you view it preview on Illustrator versus the final export. You can tell the colors look very clear. It looks like glass, it looks like resin, the text looks sharp, everything looks sharp, the line works look sharp, the colors look great. And so the diagrams look, the transparency that you add to the diagrams, as you can tell, gives it a little bit of depth, and it gives it this sense of space, but it's not too confusing. It's not like you're going to get vertigo by looking through the entire block diagram, right? And so there are pros and cons to this. So I would say the pros of doing this kind of workflow is that it's very quick to produce the actual colored diagram from Rhino. You don't have to worry about filling colors in Adobe Illustrator or making sure things are filled a certain way, and it's less things to worry about from the Adobe Illustrator standpoint. The con is that if you need to modify your colors, you need to always go back to Rhino to modify the colors versus controlling all of your colors in Adobe Illustrator. So there are pros and cons to this method, but if you're organized in your Rhino and you're organized with your layering, it's a very fast way. And to be honest, you don't even need to take it to Adobe Illustrator if you don't want to. If you're like in a time crunch and it's like a quick desk crit, for example, or a quick meeting with a client, you can just grab that screenshot of you captured a file and just throw some labels on there and you're good to go. And so I just want to make sure that you see, like the complete process of how you can produce diagrams like this, which you can use both in an academic and professional setting. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section below. If there are certain things that you want to see, let me know in the comments below. If there's any questions that you have, you can always message me. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.